Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we have another comparison video. Since last week we talked about each of the Iowa-class battleships, this week we're going to compare the Iowas to their supposed to be successors, the Montana-class battleships. This is a little bit of a sketchy model of Montana here behind me. The Montana-class battleships were designed without any treaty restrictions in mind. So they would have exceeded all other American battleships in size and capabilities. And we're going to cover just what ways that they compare to the Iowas. Also, be sure to check out our other American fast battleship videos when we compare the Iowas to the North Carolina class and the South Dakota class. If you watch those in order, you can get an idea of how these American battleships progressed through the 1930s into the ultimate design here. So initially, the Montana and the Iowa were competing designs. When the escalator clause of the London Naval Treaty went into effect, it allowed battleship construction to go from 35,000 tons, like with the North Carolina and South Dakota class, up to 45,000 tons. The question was, what did the Navy want to do with the extra 10,000 tons? So they produced two designs. One design, which became the Iowa, stretched the South Dakota and made it a 33-knot ship. The U.S. Navy had never built a fast battleship before, a truly fast capital ship for their Navy. And so this design ultimately won out because the Japanese had fast battleships. The British had battle cruisers. Modern Italian and German battleships could exceed 30 knots. The alternate design stretched the South Dakota and dropped in a fourth 16-inch turret. Now, because 10,000 tons seemed like a steep penalty to pay for just a little bit more firepower or 6 knots more speed, they increased the caliber of the main guns from 16-inch 45 caliber to 16-inch 50 caliber. And the Navy absolutely loved this gun caliber. When you compare that or combine that with the 2,700-pound super heavy shell, it ends up with very similar capabilities to 18-inch guns. And the Navy did test an 18-inch gun, and in theory they could have dropped 18-inch guns into either their Iowa or their Montana designs, but they chose to stick with the 16-inch gun. The problem with the super heavy shell is it was so much more capable than a normal 16-inch shell, the armor couldn't compare. So typically when you're building a battleship, you want armor that can stop the size guns that you're firing. You build a battleship with 16-inch guns, you want 16-inch armor plate. The Iowa-class armor system and the South Dakota-class armor system it's derived from could stop a traditional 16-inch shell, which was a little over a ton in weight. It could not stop the 2,700-pound super heavy shell. The initial 45,000 tons for Montana had basically the same armor and could not do that. So when the naval treaties disappeared and World War II started, the first thing they did was they took those early designs with the 4 turrets and started adding more and more and more armor plate. And the final tally, these battleships were going to displace about 65,000 tons standard load and about 72,000 tons fully loaded. So they would have been every bit as heavy as ships like Yamato or the Soviet Soyuz class ships that were being designed in Russia, or other super battleships, the H-class being designed in Germany. As it turns out, the Yamatos were the only super battleships ever built. 5 Montanas were authorized, none were ever laid down, and as carriers became more supreme, they were canceled. Ultimately, the battleship had grown too heavy to be cost effective. The Navy would not only have had to pay for a 920-something foot long ship, significantly longer than the Iowas, they also had to pay to make dry docks and berths that could accommodate a 65,000-ton, 900-foot long ship. And this was the first class of American battleship to be designed exceeding the width of the Panama Canal. They would have been over 120 feet wide. The locks of the Panama Canal only 110 feet. So paired with this project was a plan to widen the locks of the Panama Canal, another costly endeavor. So when you add all these costs together and then realize that battleships are becoming marginal, the Navy very quickly and quietly decided not to lay down any of these ships. They were able to lay down many more carriers. The Essex-class carriers displaced about 32,000 tons, so you could build 2 of them for the same material it took to build one of these. And ultimately, that ship was a war-winning weapon. Now, initially, there were only going to be 4 Iowa-class battleships, and battleship number 65 was going to be the Montana class. Because the Iowa design was complete at the beginning of World War II, and the Montana class was still expanding, the decision was made to authorize 2 more Iowas, Illinois and Kentucky, and bump the Montanas back a couple places. So Montana was going to be designated BB 67. 68 would have been Maine. 69 would have been Ohio. 70 would have been New Hampshire. And 71 would have been Louisiana. Fun fact for you, Montana was the only state that never had a battleship built in its honor. The name was authorized twice. Once on the 1920s era South Dakota class, which was canceled by the Washington Naval Treaty, and then once with the Montana class, which was canceled. It is possible that since New Jersey's name was sort of bumped ahead in the listing for battleships, that New Jersey is the reason why there was never a USS Montana. Now, the name New Jersey was chosen for the second Iowa-class battleship because the Secretary of the Navy at the time, Charles Edison, was from New Jersey. So he wanted his home state's name selected. Had 62 not been designated New Jersey, Montana was in the roster for names to be used, and with it not being selected there, it gets bumped back to 65 and then back to 67, and it ends up not being used at all. Other states that don't have battleships named after them are Alaska and Hawaii. And that's because they were only territories when we were building battleships. By the time we stopped building battleships, they still hadn't become states yet. There were a pair of large cruisers, which we'll probably compare to the Iowas in a future video, called the Alaska class, which are very close to capital ships. Some people call them battle cruisers. So, Montana was authorized twice, never used. Alaska was authorized for a large cruiser, was built as a large cruiser, never as a battleship. Hawaii authorized as a large cruiser, never completed. Let's talk a little bit about this model here. This model is more or less taking an Iowa class and stretching it and adding an extra gun turret. That's not actually what the Montanas were. Their superstructure was unique to them. It was not an Iowa class repurposed. Also, designs for the ship never had the full wartime complement of anti-aircraft guns. And it's never really sat right with me where this model places all the anti-aircraft guns. I don't think it's accurate to how other ships that got wartime upgrades got them. In terms of armament, if 3 is good, 4 must be better. The Montanas used the same 16-inch 50 caliber gun as the Iowas. It would have had more armor plate around it, but same basic gun. The only difference is they returned to the pre-World War II standard type where you had an equal number of turrets forward and aft. Secondary battery is where the design changed. Initial designs involved the same 10 twin-mounted 5-inch 38 caliber guns as all of the American treaty battleships. But at a certain point, the Navy decided that the 5-inch 38, while it was a great weapon, probably the best dual-purpose weapon in World War II, it did not have enough range. They wanted future capital ship designs to have a secondary battery with a longer range. So the way to increase range is to increase the caliber of the guns. So they began developing a 5-inch 54 caliber gun. And this weapon system did end up equipping many of the immediate post-war ships of the late 40s and early 50s, and was in service into at least the 90s, if not the early 2000s. In practice, it was a much heavier shell, 70 pounds versus 55, so rate of fire with a manual loaded mount, like the Montanas were going to get, would not have been as good as the 5-inch 38. It probably wouldn't have been as good as an anti-aircraft weapon, although it would have been a much superior anti-surface weapon. Later ships were equipped with automatic loaders, and if Montana had been built, the length of time it would have taken to construct the ship may well have meant that she would have gotten auto loaders added as well. If they weren't added during construction, though, I'm not sure they ever would have been. The Iowas never had their guns retrofitted to automatically load, and even in the 90s were still manually loading. In terms of anti-aircraft guns, you would have seen the same suite of 40mm and 20mm guns as other ships. Again, the design process stopped at a certain point, so we never got to see what the wartime upgrades would have been for these ships. Early blueprints showed the pre-war anti-aircraft batteries of 1.1-inch guns and 50 caliber machine guns, and then when those get superseded by the 40 mils and the 20 mils, you start to see more and more of them working their way into later designs. Final count, if you look at Wikipedia, you'll see that they would have had 10 quad 40 mounts and 50 some odd 20 millimeters. The Iowas had 20 quad 40 mounts and 49 20 millimeters. So you would have likely seen that number of 40 millimeter mounts at least double, if not more. The Montanas were a longer ship. They had more deck space for these guns. And if they were completed post-war, they might have not gotten the 40 millimeters and 20 millimeters as the kamikaze threat late war proved those weapons incapable of fully destroying those aircraft. So the Navy started to switch to 3-inch guns in place of that, usually add a 2 twin 3-inch guns for 3 quad 40mm guns. So you may well have seen these ships completed with a 3-inch battery. Again, the 3-inch guns came with a hand-loading model and an auto-loading model. Depending on when these ships would have been completed, might have determined what sort of model they got. Fun fact, the Iowas in the late 50s started to get modifications so they could receive 3-inch guns in place of their 40 millimeters. Some of them even got the fire control systems for them. But they were all decommissioned by 1958 before any of those guns had been replaced. And by the 60s and 80s, when they were brought back out of service, using guns as anti-aircraft weapons against jets had completely fallen out of practice, so they were never retrofitted. Now we're between the holding bulkhead and the armored belt on USS New Jersey. Armor was the biggest achievement of the Montanas over the Iowa class. Like I said, early designs had the same armor as the Iowas and South Dakotas. The Navy was never really happy with this armor because it couldn't stop the super heavy shell. And so when the treaty restrictions were lifted, they immediately started expanding the design to have more armor. Like I said, armor was one of many things that the Navy didn't like about the Iowa-class battleships. Earlier classes of ships had prioritized firepower and armor at the expense of speed. The Iowas were a departure from that. The U.S. Navy had no fast ships, capital ships, so they prioritized speed first and then firepower and armor last. In the future, we're going to make a video discussing other things that the Navy didn't like about the Iowas, so stay tuned for that one. The Iowas only had a 12.1 inch thick armored belt. It was angled at 19 degrees. The Montanas had a 16.1 inch belt angled at 19 degrees. When you angle the armor, it gives it a greater equivalent thickness. The shell has more to pass through than if it's just going through straight. However, in order to get the same height, you have to have more armor plate than if you just had a straight up and down belt. All told, the weight savings from angling your belt, even though it had to be taller, was worth it in compared to just having a straight up and down belt that was thicker. Also, as you start to get to 16 inches of armor and thicker, it's much harder to cast that. So, getting thicker than that, it's difficult. And if you layer armor, it's nowhere near the equivalent thickness of it. It's just a solid piece. The other issue with an angled belt is now your ship is out here at top, but when you get to the waterline, it's come in significantly. So you're losing some of your internal volume and buoyancy. The Iowas have an interior armored belt. So a shell has to pass through several thinner layers of armor before it contacts the belt. And the Navy hoped that this would decap armor-piercing shells and prevent them from hitting the belt with their full force, so that a 12-inch belt could have the same equivalence of something much thicker. That wasn't their preferred method, though. They preferred to have an external belt because if the internal belt is damaged, you have to cut through several layers of armor steel to fix the belt. With an external belt, you don't need to do that. Also, building the ship is more difficult. With an internal belt, you have to build it with the belt on it, which means that you're launching a much heavier ship. With an external belt, you build it without the belt. You launch it nice and light, and then you add the belt onto it while it's in the water. The North Carolinas had an external belt, South Dakotas and Iowas had an internal, and early designs for the Montana had an internal. But at the end of the day, the Navy chose to go back to an external belt. In terms of other armor plating, it's thicker across the board. The gun turrets receive several inches more armor. The decks are more armored. The torpedo bulkhead is much more armored. The forward and aft bulkheads are much more armored. Just blanket statement across the board. Engineering is another area where the Iowas differ significantly from the Montanas. In order to achieve their high speed, the Iowas have 212,000 horsepower. Montana designs looked at building a ship that was 30 plus knot speed, like the aircraft carriers, but the size of these designs grew way out of proportion. So they decided to limit it at the same 28 knots that earlier fast battleships could make, the North Carolinas and the South Dakotas. So that the Iowa class would form a fast wing, the older battleships would form a slow 21 knot wing, and the modern fast battleships would have a standard 28 knot speed. The Montanas would have had propulsion equipment for 172,000 horsepower. Still a considerable amount, but dwarfed in comparison to the Iowas. The equipment was more or less the same. Babcock's and Wilcox boilers, Westinghouse turbines, for propellers, 2 rudders, very, very similar equipment, but the arrangement was all different. On the Iowa-class battleships, you have Broadway like this, which is one central passageway that then accesses each of the fire rooms and engine rooms. On the Montanas, they reverted to the older style, which is more of a loop around third deck of the ship, with access to various boiler rooms and engine rooms. Now, unlike the Iowas, which have 2 boilers in each room, the Montanas would have only had 1 in each room. This made for better damage control. It was more weight because there's more compartmentalization, but it's better damage control. A hit that defeats their torpedo defense is only going to knock out 1 or at most 2 boilers if it hits on a bulkhead. Also, the boilers on the outside with the engines on the inside meant that the engine rooms were unlikely to be taken out, so the ship could continue to run on 4 shafts. Whereas a hit on an Iowa-class battleship would mean that if it hits on the bulkhead, you can knock out an entire fire room and an entire engine room. Not really possible on the Montanas. Not only do they have better torpedo defense, and torpedo defense was the thing that the Navy probably hated the most about the Iowas, but they had better subdivision. Now that said, the Iowas had twice the subdivision of earlier South Dakota class battleships. So the Navy is getting better, for lack of a better word, with this. And it's not that they don't know this is a problem, and wartime experience shows them this. The earlier standard type battleships had a lot of internal subdivision and fire rooms on the outside with engine rooms on the inside, but they had much smaller propulsion plants, and again, it was heavy. It was just heavier, and with the treaty restrictions, the Navy had to take a lesser option to save weight. With the Montanas, when those treaty restrictions go out, they're able to subdivide again like they like. So, final analysis. The Montana class is better than the Iowas in almost every way. At 28 knots, they are still counted as fast battleships that can keep up with the carriers. The North Carolinas and the South Dakotas did. The fact that the Iowas had 33 knots and could better keep up with the carriers didn't really matter because the carriers were doing 28 knots to keep up with the slower, fast battleships. In armor, blows these ships out of the water. In firepower, they have 33% more, an extra gun turret. So the Montanas win there too. They have the same fire control system and fire control computer. So these ships would have been the best battleships in the world. They were better than any of the ones that were actually built. They would have been better than Germany's H-class or the Soviet Soyuz class or really anything else reasonable that was on the drawing board. And the Iowas were a reasonable match for the larger Yamatos. The Montanas would have been a pretty sure bet in that case. But battleship gigantism was a thing. They got larger and more expensive, and their role became more specialized as other ships became effective at destroying enemy warships, submarines for one, aircraft carriers for another. Battleships' usefulness in that began to decline. And so they start getting relegated to supporting amphibious invasions with shore bombardment. And the Montanas would have been great at that. It would have been overkill. The Iowas were overkill for it in a lot of circumstances. what if these ships had been built? What would their service lives have been like? The North Carolina class was kept in service a little bit longer than the South Dakota class because they were larger, longer, they had more habitability and a slightly higher speed. And the Iowas were kept in service even longer than them because they were much, much longer. They had much more internal volume for crew and much more reserve displacement for adding more weight and more modern things onto them. Had the Montanas been built, there's a good possibility that they would have been chosen for reactivation over the Iowas, unless the Navy wanted those 6 knots of extra speed, or the cheaper unit. Thanks for watching. Remember to tune in every week for more content like this. This video was selected by a viewer. We were going to start talking more about European battleships this week, but somebody reached out and said that they liked what they were doing with the other American fast battleships and they wanted to see how Montana compared. So if you have other ships you would like to see compared, drop them in the comment section. If you have questions or comments about the video, leave them below in the comment section and we'll get back to you. Otherwise, check out the description below for ways you can support the channel and help us create more content like this. And thanks for watching.